Hapere, Guahusi Victoria Lola Leon Guerrero with Independent Guåhan. In case you didn't make it out last month to our Ayuda and Mañainåta event, we wanted to answer some of your frequently asked questions and walk you through the Guam War Claims form process. One of the first things people ask is, where do I find the form? There isn't a local office appointed with filling out these forms. In fact, the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission, located in Washington, D.C., is a federal agency that was appointed by law to oversee the claims process. And so Congresswoman Bordalio's office may have copies of the form, but otherwise the form is located online or can be found online. And what you would do is go to your internet browser and search for the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission. Usually it's the first link that pops up, so click on that. And on their homepage, they have a section under News about Guam's World War II Loyalty Recognition Act Claims Program. And it states very clearly that the program opened up on June 20, 2017, and therefore the deadline to file claims is June 20, 2018. Right there in that section of the website, it says the claim forms and instructions are available here. So you click on that. And when you get there, it'll give you the language from the law that explains who a compensable Guam victim is, and then provides links to the form in both English and Chamorro, and instructions on how to fill it out also in English and Chamorro, and frequently asked questions. In the instructions, you'll learn who is eligible, and this is also probably the most frequently asked question, and one of the hardest questions that we've had to answer is that if your loved one suffered during the war and survived, but has died since, and if they died before the law was enacted on December 23rd, 2016, they are no longer eligible to file a claim, which means that none of their descendants or survivors, their legal representative, nobody is eligible for filing a claim on their behalf if they were not alive on the enactment of the law on December 23rd, 2016. So if your loved one passed away in 1972 or 1987 or 2003, or even in 2016, but it was before December 23rd, unfortunately, they are not eligible to file a claim. This is very clearly expressed in the instructions, and it literally comes from the law itself. So if you have more questions about why your loved one is not eligible, I strongly encourage that you talk with Congresswoman Bordalio's office, because they were responsible for authoring the law, and try to understand this better with them. For those, however, who were alive when the law was enacted, and are still alive or have since died, you are eligible to file a claim. Also, if you have a loved one who died during the war, you may be eligible to file a claim. So let's open the form and see where you would fill out this information. So we're going into the English form for the purposes of this tutorial. And you'll notice right away at the top, it asks you to fill out the information if you are a claimant. So this would be somebody who, a claimant is somebody who either survived the war and was a victim of forced march, internment, forced labor, rape, and personal injury. If you experienced any of these things, which most people who lived during the war experienced, you would be considered a claimant, and you would fill out all of the basic information, your name, your address. It asks you for a street address. However, considering that the Foreign Claims Review Commission will likely be communicating with you through mail, you may want to instead put your mailing address or add your mailing address and emphasize that this is your mailing address. Fill out all the other relevant information, including your date of birth. The next section in the form is for a legal representative. Now, the legal representative is somebody who has power of attorney, or is the spouse of somebody who is not able to fill out the form themselves or has died since the enactment of the law. So the legal representative, that section is for somebody whose loved one was alive on December 23rd and has since died, December 23rd, 2016, and has since died. You would basically fill in your information, and you would want to include as evidence attached to the form a copy of your power of attorney if you have one. If you are the spouse of the person who died, you would want to provide your marriage license or your most recent tax return, which shows that you are married to the person who died. If you are their child, you would again want to show this through a birth certificate that shows they are your parent, and also you would want to include that person's death certificate to show that they were alive when the law was enacted but have since died. So all of that information would go into the section on legal representative. If you have any questions about whether or not you are the legal representative, or if there is other evidence that you'll need to include, you'll need to contact the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission, and we'll provide their information at the end of this tutorial. Now, after you fill out the claimant's name or the legal representative's name, you would go to the basic claim information. At the top, it asks whether you are the survivor of a compensable Guam dissident, which is somebody who died during the war. And this person has to be either the spouse, child, or parent of the person who died in the war as a result of the attack by the Japanese or as a result of the occupation and liberation of Guam by the Americans. The other person who is eligible to file a claim is somebody who is a compensable Guam victim, meaning that you suffered any of the following as a result of Guam's attack or the liberation of Guam by the Americans. Hiding to evade internment, which means that you are held against your will. So if you or your family member was held at Mañainåta or any other camp on the island because of their circumstances, that would make them eligible for internment. If your family was hiding to avoid that circumstance, that would be eligible for hiding to evade internment. Forced march, so if you were marched to internment or marched at all. Forced labor, any time that you were forced to work without being properly compensated. Personal injury, severe personal injury, or rape. These are all of the things that are compensable according to the law. Then it asks you to express whether or not you are a resident of Guam, and if so, the dates of your residency. So you want to say, most people fill out that they've been a resident from birth until now. But if you've left Guam and come back, I guess that they just want you to express, the times that you've been a resident here. You don't have to be a resident of Guam to fill out the form. So if you are a survivor of the war who no longer lives on Guam as a resident elsewhere, that doesn't mean you're not eligible to fill out the form. You're just not currently a resident of Guam. The first part is the claim of survivor of a compensable Guam dissident. And this is, again, the section for somebody who has died. So it asks you, if you're the spouse, child, parent of somebody that died during the war, and you have to list their name, how you're related to them, their date of death, and whether or not they were a resident of Guam when they died, and what their dates of residency are. If you're unsure, because a lot of people who died in the war, there are no death records, there may not even be birth certificates available any longer, you would of course want to try to get as close to the dates as possible. They also want to know all of the survivors of the person who died. So for example, if the person's parent and spouse have died, and there are 5 of 10 children that are still alive, you would list all 5 of the children that are still alive. Because that means that all of them would have to split the claim, because they would then be eligible. And then you would provide a detailed account of that person's death. They want you to specify the cause of their death and all the information that you know. They also ask that if you have any evidence, you can provide that. So if there are medical records, if there is a death certificate, if there are articles that were written about this person's death, if other loved ones shared the story of this person's death and it's been recorded, the transcripts of those things could be made available as evidence. But really, you just want to provide all the information that you have. The more information, the better. So The next part of the form is for those who are a compensable Guam victim, meaning that you survived the war, you were a victim of the war, and you are still alive, or you were alive on the date of the enactment of the law on December 23rd, 2016, but have since died. Now, in some cases, someone may be the child of someone who died in the war and a compensable Guam victim. In that case, then they would simply fill out both parts of the form. The part for their parent, if they are the eldest child, for example, then they could fill out that part as long as they list all the other children that remain living. And then they could fill out the section relating to themselves. And so the section relating to the survivors of the war is divided based on claims. So the first claim that you can fill out again is hiding to evade internment. This again, as I said, is when you are hiding so that the Japanese don't imprison you or so that you aren't sent to a camp. So for example, at the end of the war, I've filled out forms for survivors who were hiding in Mokfok and didn't go to Mañainåta, or were in different parts of the island and were hiding. A lot of people hid at the beginning of the war when the Japanese first attacked. All of these things are important to note and are examples of hiding to evade internment. And so you would basically answer yes. It asks, did you hide? They give you a drop-down menu of yes or no, and so you would either answer yes or no. So if you did, then you would have to provide the approximate dates and location of your hiding. If you don't remember the exact date, that is okay. You can use history to guide you. So for example, for people that were hiding at the beginning of the war, then you would say early December until, some people hid until January and then came out of hiding and went to a ranch or hid at a different loved one's house. Some people at different points in the war, when the Japanese were coming to raid their homes, hid under beds. Those would be things that you would want to write down. And say again, you don't know the exact date, you can do the month and the year. And then again, at the end of the war, we know that the march to Mañainåta and the internment in Mañainåta was in July, so you would write July 1944. And then basically provide a detailed account of the facts or circumstances related to your hiding and the conditions you experienced while in hiding. This is incredibly important because this is also our way of documenting history. So please put all the information that you remember or that your loved one remembers or that you remember being told by your loved one in this section, and follow that policy throughout the form. The next section is for internment. And again, it asks you yes or no, were you interned? You drop down the menu and state whether or not. You provide the approximate date. So one of the things that initially was confusing for people is that they didn't realize that internment meant the experience at Mañainåta. So there were a lot of survivors of Mañainåta who initially read the form and didn't realize that that was the place where they would list what they experienced there. So again, if your family was brought to the Mañainåta concentration camp in Guåhan, you would basically fill out this portion. It would be in July 1944. Or even if earlier in the war, for example, an older man who I helped fill out the form, his family was displaced from their home and brought to NCS to build a makeshift camp for the Japanese, and then they were held at the camp without being allowed to go home. That is a form of internment, and we filled that out in this section. So you would provide detailed accounts of your memories of the conditions of the internment. A lot of survivors that are still alive today were very young during the war and don't always remember all the facts or circumstances. In that case, they can write what they were told. So if you were a baby during the war and your mother shared that she didn't have milk to give you, or that you were very sick at Mañainåta, write that down, because her memories are your memories now. The next section is forced march. Even though the forced march for most people happened before the internment, it comes after it on the form. So keep that in mind, because when you're filling out the internment, some people may want to include the details of the march, but you may want to save that for the next section. They again ask if you were a victim of forced march. You hit yes or no, provide the approximate dates and where it took place, and then again provide the conditions. In some cases, you would want to start with, where Where were you? How were you and your family members brought to the march? So you'll notice that, it's a very small box that you would fill in with your story. And so if you're using an advanced PDF program, you may possibly be able to change your font size to be a little bit smaller for the box. Another really important thing to note is that not all PDF programs are advanced enough to save the form. So you may find that you want to save the form and come back to it later, and it'll tell you that it can't save. In that case, if you must close the window, you can copy and paste everything you've done up to that point into a Word document, and then you'll just have to copy and paste it back into the form. But hopefully you have an Adobe program that allows you to save the form. If not, then of course you're going to want to just push through it and print it out. But basically, coming back to the form, if it doesn't fit, if the details of the account don't fit in the small box, then you are welcome to attach additional pages as necessary. And again, you can just copy and paste it into a Word document and finish the entire story and attach it. The next portion is for forced labor. Forced labor, there were some very clear moments of forced labor that a lot of people partook in. So things like working in the vegetable fields, working to build the airstrip at Tidzin, picking sweet potatoes, doing any kind of labor for the Japanese in places like Ta'i, where you hear this a lot, that a lot of survivors who were teenagers or older had to report to work every day and were never compensated. Those are some of the very obvious incidents of forced labor, but there were others where, a war survivor I interviewed was 9 and every day had to walk back and forth between Totsu and Hagåtña to bring food back and forth to the Japanese, and so was never compensated. And so those are things that you can consider forced labor if you were working and there was no compensation. So it asks you, again, yes or no, were you a victim of forced labor? Provide the approximate dates and location where the labor was performed. Some people had multiple accounts of forced labor, so again, you want to include all those different accounts, dates and times and places. Provide your age at the time the labor was performed. And then, did you receive compensation for your labor? Again, this would be, were you paid for the work that you did? And then again, it asks you to provide a detailed description of the forced labor and attach any additional pages if necessary. The next section has to do with personal injury. And in this section, it asks again if you suffered personal injury, and then it gives you a list of the following: dismemberment, loss of limb, paralysis, disfigurement, burns, or scarring as the types of injury that are, that you could choose. But there are also 2 boxes that say other, and if you go to this box that says other, you would click other and then click on the box that says other, and you can actually write in the kind of injury. So for example, one of the survivors I interviewed said that she suffered from what would be labeled classic post-traumatic stress syndrome, where she had worried every day of the war that her parents were going to die, and so to this day is terribly afraid of being alone and suffers from severe anxiety. And so we went ahead and we listed PTSD, and we wrote the date in which it happened. So for each one of these injuries, they again ask you to specify the approximate date of the injury and the place of the injury. The place of the injury meaning where did the injury occur. And then in the box at the bottom, you can elaborate on exactly what happened. Again, here they ask that the claim form can include other evidence, including photographic evidence of the injury that supports the claim. So for example, if you suffered from dismemberment, if there are photos of your loss of limb, if you were hospitalized after the war because of illness, that can be considered an injury, and you would simply attach any hospital records that you have, if that is something that you have. Again, be mindful that a lot of people came out of the war without any photographs or any records, and really all that they have are their memories. But if there is anything that can substantiate the claim, please make copies and include that. And then they ask if your injury required treatment, yes or no, and then specify where you were treated and what kind of treatment you received. Again, a lot of people, there was no hospital during the war that they could go to. A lot of people turned to traditional medicine. There were some Japanese doctors on the island, and you can describe that, or some people didn't receive medical treatment until after the war, and that again can be included. The final section, which is often one, if you are helping a war survivor fill out a form, a very sensitive one to enter into, and this is the section for rape. And it's very important that if you are helping somebody fill out their form, that you really allow them the space to talk about it and give the information that they feel comfortable giving. But asking too many questions or putting them in a position where they'll feel ashamed about their experience will definitely shut down this process. And so again, if you are the child of a survivor and the survivor is telling you for the first time that they have been raped or that they have experienced severe personal injury, this is a very emotional situation. You want to avoid leading questions about, well, what were you wearing or what were you doing, that may make them feel mamala or not really want to share with you. The most important thing is getting the information down so that they can receive justice for this situation. So again, you would ask, or were you a victim of rape, yes or no? They would have to provide the approximate date and location, and then a detailed account of what happened, and if there is any evidence, then you can attach that, or any additional pages. And then finally, this is another very sensitive part of the form. There is a section for the level of payment sought. So most people you will find are eligible for more than one of these categories of claims. That many people were, experienced forced march and internment. Many people hid and were victims of forced labor, or people may have had severe personal injury and been raped. However, the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission, when we wrote and asked about it, if you notice, there is a drop-down menu, and you have to choose between the three kinds of claims that you'd be eligible for. And so we wrote to the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission and asked, well, if a survivor is eligible for all three, would they fill out three forms? And they said no, they are only going to be able to compensate for one kind of claim, and they recommended that the survivor choose the claim amount that is the highest. And so therefore, if somebody experienced forced march but also severe personal injury, then you would want to click on the part of the drop-down menu for severe personal injury. So going through the amounts, if you're filling it out by hand, you're going to have to write in the amount and what qualifies them for that amount. So it's $15,000 for severe personal injury, such as loss of limb, dismemberment, or paralysis, or for rape. It's $12,000 for forced labor or personal injury, such as disfigurement, scarring, or burns. And it's $10,000 for forced march, internment, or hiding to evade internment. Now, you remember that the portion of the form for a person who died in the war, that is at the top of the form, and anybody who died in the war, it is one solid amount of $25,000. So that's why you'll notice it's not here in the drop-down menu. So if you're filling out a form for a loved one who died during the war, once you fill out the portion at the top of the form, then it is already a given that they are eligible for the $25,000 compensation, and you would not put it in this portion that says level of payment sought, because this is only for compensable Guam victims. They also ask if you or your loved one has ever received compensation before for suffering during the war, because in 1945 there was a Guam Meritorious Claims Act in which some claims were given out, but it was found that a vast majority of the people that were alive during the war did not file or receive claims. And so therefore, that is why this section exists. So if you did file and receive a claim, you can say yes, and you would state the date that you received it and how much you were given. But most people are not eligible for this portion. Another thing that people tend to ask is, there was a Guam War Claims Review Commission in 2003 that was established to hear the stories of war survivors in order to bring their stories to Congress and justify the need for war reparations. a lot of survivors and a lot of the descendants of survivors who have since died regularly ask me whether or not that counts as having filled out a claim. It does not count. That was not a claim that was being officially filled out. That was literally just people giving their testimonies, saying what their story was. So some people are under the belief that I already filled out a form because I participated in that process. No, if you went to the Guam War Claims Review Commission and shared your story, that does not count as a claims form, and you still need to fill this one out. And then finally, the form needs to be printed out. Once you've reached this part of the form, you want to save it if you can save it. If you're not able to save it, print it out right away. And I highly recommend printing at least 3 copies so that you have some backup. So print out 3 copies, and then you need to get the form notarized by a notary public. We were informed that the Public Defender's Office is offering free notary services to people that are filling out their forms. So you can go to the Public Defender's Office in Sinahaña, or you can go to your bank, and there's usually notary publics at your bank. And so then basically you would swear before the notary public. You need to provide an ID. If you're filling out the form for a parent who died in the war, or died, or who was alive on the enactment of law and have since died, you want to bring their death certificate and show your relationship to them so that then the notary can notarize your form. And then again, once it's been notarized, you want to have copies of it having been notarized. And then basically you want to mail it in. Now, one of the craziest things is that the form itself doesn't include the mailing address. So you have to go back to the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission's website. And under the important documents, you'll see a link to the claim form instructions. So if you click on the instructions, at the very bottom of the instructions is the address to the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission. Above the address, it says for more information. It provides their phone numbers. It provides their email address. So if you have any questions at all that I didn't answer today, call them directly. That's the best source of information in this process. But once you've printed out, notarized your form, you're good to go. Go to the instructions form, and you will basically want to mail the form to the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission at 600 East Street, Northwest, room 6002, Washington, D.C. 20579. You do that certified mail, go to your post office, give them that address, have it sent via certified mail, and ask for a receipt, a return receipt, so that you know that your claims form has been received. And that's it, Pansit. It's a very long process, but I highly recommend that you get started today.